They say fabric remembers the hands that touched it. If that's true, then every thread in this room still hums with what I felt the day she walked in. The morning had started like any other. Gray light, slow coffee, the city pretending it still had a pulse. I'd opened the studio early, hoping for silence. My machines were still sleeping, the mannequins waiting in their corners like witnesses. The scent of cotton starch hung in the air, clean and honest. Everything around me still believed in the illusion of peace. Then the doorbell chimed. It wasn't the usual quick, polite ring of a client. This was deliberate. A slow press. The kind of sound that announces power before you even see it. I looked up, scissors in hand, as she entered. Helga Winter. I knew the face before the voice. Everyone did. She'd been on magazine covers and charity stages, photographed planting trees she'd ordered cut down the week before. Her smile was the kind of PR invention that cost a small fortune in lighting design. CEO of Vinteratech, the world's most sustainable materials company, and the reason my husband was sitting in a concrete cell. Madame Moreau, she said, extending a gloved hand as if we'd already met in better times. Her tone was syrup over steel. You come highly recommended. I wiped my palms on my apron before shaking her hand. Her skin was cool, like glass left in shade. Welcome, I said. What can I create for you? I have an event, she said. The Global Future Summit. Cameras, ministers, philanthropists. The usual circus. I need something spectacular. Something that says hope. She walked deeper into the studio, heels ticking against the concrete floor like a metronome for my pulse. Sunlight caught on her hair, silver blonde, too perfect to be real, and flashed across the framed photographs on my wall. One of those photos showed my husband standing beside me at an environmental protest, a hand-painted sign half out of frame. Clean water, clean truth. I turned it face down before she noticed. Spectacular, I echoed. Yes. She slipped off her gloves, revealing long manicured fingers, the nails lacquered a faint pearl. But also, ethical. Naturally. She smiled at that word as if she owned it. You work with recycled fabrics, don't you? I do, I said. My voice stayed calm, only the inside of me burned. Excellent. Then perhaps we can make something symbolic. The future of fashion, you know. A dress that breathes responsibility. She laughed, a sound like broken glass tumbling in water. You'd think after so many speeches I'd be immune to metaphors. I forced a polite smile. Breathing responsibility, I repeated, picking up my measuring tape. That can be arranged? She didn't notice the edge in my tone. Or maybe she did and enjoyed it. Women like her collect reactions the way others collect jewelry. Would you mind standing here? I gestured toward the mirror platform. Helga stepped up gracefully, shrugging off her coat. Beneath it, she wore a simple black sheath. Corporate armor. Even in silence, she radiated the certainty of someone who never had to wait for anything. Tell me, she said as I unrolled the tape. What inspires you, Madame Moreau? Imperfections, I said. She laughed again. Oh, that's refreshing. Most designers say love or beauty. They lie. I wrapped the tape around her waist, not too tightly, yet. Perfection doesn't teach you anything. She tilted her head, studying me in the mirror. You sound like a philosopher. Just someone who sews for a living. Still, she said, you have a certain conviction. I like that. Her eyes met mine in the reflection, searching, curious. Are you married? My fingers paused for half a heartbeat. I was, I said. He's, away. Oh. The curiosity sharpened. Business or pleasure? Neither, I said softly, measuring the length from shoulder to floor. Justice. Her brows lifted, amused. How mysterious. You'll have your measurements tomorrow, I said before she could dig deeper. She smiled, satisfied, and turned her attention back to her own reflection. Make it white, she said. symbol of renewal, with silver accent, something futuristic. It should look pure but powerful. Pure but powerful. The kind of phrase her marketing department would trademark. As you wish, I said. She pivoted, letting the light slide across her face. Up close, the mask of youth wavered, fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the faint sag of exhaustion. But power disguised fatigue well. It always had. Tell me, she said, have you ever designed for anyone important? I considered the question. Once, I said. But he didn't make it to the show. She laughed politely, missing the weight beneath the words. I'll need it in 10 days, she said briskly. You'll be compensated generously. I'm sure, I murmured. When she left, the scent of her perfume stayed behind. Expensive, synthetic, a chemical garden. I opened the window to let it out, but the smell clung to the air, stubborn and sweet. I sat down at my table and stared at my hands. They were steady, though my heart was not. It had been almost a year since I'd last seen those white logos, Vinteratech. Tomorrow starts clean. A year since I'd watched the footage of my husband being led away in handcuffs after publishing his final article, the one that exposed how Vinteratech dumped waste into the river outside Lyon. A year since Helga Winter had gone on television to call him a threat to innovation. I had learned silence since then. It's easy. You stitch it into your breathing until it feels like skin. On the cutting table lay a roll of pale fabric, its sheen dull in the afternoon light. I brushed my fingers across it, feeling its cold texture. Recycled polymer blend. One of hers. The label still carried the company code. I'd picked it up from a clearance sale months ago, back when I couldn't afford to be sentimental. Now it felt like fate. I unrolled the fabric slowly. It made a faint static hiss, like something alive remembering its origin. I cut the first piece. The next day, she returned with 2 assistants. They were identical. Slick hair, tablets in hand, faces wiped of personality. They documented everything, the sketches, the samples, the color swatches she rejected before finally approving the white-silver composite. I'll need a detachable train, she said. Something dramatic for the cameras. Of course. And please, no visible seams. I want it to feel inevitable. Understood. She talked while I worked, about investors, algorithms, her upcoming TED speech on sustainability. Her words filled the room like static, meaning nothing and everything at once. I let her talk. The more people speak, the less they see. When she finally left, the studio felt empty in a way that wasn't relief. I stood by the mirror where she had posed and saw her shape ghosted there. The outline of arrogance, the echo of perfume. In the reflection, my own face looked sharper, older. Grief does that. It carves you into the weapon you need to become. I picked up my needle. Nights stretched thin after that. The hum of the sewing machine became heartbeat and confession. Each stitch steadied me. Each fold of fabric was another layer between what I felt and what I showed. Sometimes I imagined my husband's voice low and teasing. You're doing it again, Lise, losing yourself in the seams. And I'd answer him silently. That's where I find what's left of us. I dreamed of the river, the one his article had shown on camera, green foam curling over black water. They'd said the footage was fake, edited. The corporation sued. The court agreed. He'd been charged with defamation, cyber fraud, incitement against national industry. No bail, no visitors, no clean air. When I woke from those dreams, I sewed until dawn. By the 5th day, the skeleton of the gown hung on the mannequin. Pale, precise, shimmering faintly like a lie told too often. It caught the early light and threw it back cold. I traced my finger along the spine seam. The line was perfect. On the 7th day, she came unannounced, stepping in without knocking. Progress? She asked, peeling off her sunglasses. I gestured toward the mannequin. See for yourself. Her eyes widened. It's beautiful. She approached it slowly, touching the fabric with reverence. So light. It breathes, I said. Just like you asked. May I? She lifted the edge of the train. It's softer than I expected. It's a new blend, I said, watching her fingers. Made from repurposed industrial fibers. How fascinating. She smiled. Reborn waste? There's poetry in that. Yes, I said. Everything becomes something else. She didn't hear the second meaning. You'll have to tell me the source, she said. We might invest. I smiled. You already have. For a moment, her eyes flicked toward mine. Curious. Then her phone vibrated. 1 second, she murmured, turning away to answer. Her voice dropped to that polished tone she reserved for investors. Soft dominance wrapped in charm. I studied her reflection. Power like hers was always an illusion stitched from fear and vanity. It only took the right thread to pull, and everything unraveled. She hung up, all smiles again. Apologies. You know how it is, and saving the planet never sleeps. Of course. I'll need it by Monday morning, she said. We're flying to Geneva that afternoon. There will be a press conference before the gala. It will be ready. She reached out, brushing my arm lightly. I knew I could trust you. Her touch was brief but electric. Not warmth, but the spark that leaps before combustion. I waited until the door closed behind her before letting out the breath I'd been holding. The scent of her perfume lingered again. This time I didn't open the window. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat on the floor beside the mannequin, the half-finished gown gleaming in the low light. It seemed to glow from within, whispering with every movement of air. I thought about the word trust, how she'd used it without irony, how my husband had used it in his last message to me. Trust the work. He'd meant his writing, his truth. Mine would have to take another form. The clock on the wall ticked past 2. Outside, a garbage truck clattered down the street, collecting the city's sins for recycling. I picked up my needle and began again, the thread sliding through my fingers like a pulse. By the 10th morning, the dress was finished. White as a confession, smooth as denial, it hung perfectly on the mannequin, its folds catching light like frozen water. Anyone else would have called it pure. I knew better. Purity is just the absence of witnesses. When she arrived for the final fitting, she stood before the mirror in silence, eyes shining. It's flawless, she whispered. You've given me exactly what I wanted. Maybe, I said. Maybe even more. She laughed softly. You're quite the poet, Madame Moreau. You should come to Geneva, see it on stage. Perhaps I will. She didn't notice my hands, how still they were, how certain. Or maybe she did, and mistook that calm for surrender. Either way, she left the studio believing the world was still hers. When the door closed, I turned off the lights and stood in the dark for a long time, listening to the city outside, the hum of traffic, the low thunder of rain on the rooftops, the distant sirens, every sound stitching itself into silence. The dress gleamed faintly in the gloom, catching the streetlight through the blinds. It looked alive. It looked ready. And for the first time in a year, so was I. My name is Elise Monroe, and I am 33 years old. People think Monroe sounds glamorous, old Hollywood even. But to me, it's just the name on the lease, the one I never changed when I married. I kept it partly for paperwork, partly for superstition, but mostly because Monroe Atelier existed before I did. At least before the version of me that belonged to anyone else. I opened the studio at 27 with nothing but a second-hand sewing machine, a pile of cast-off fabric, and a conviction that beauty could be honest. Back then, fashion still felt like art, not strategy. I took in hem repairs and alterations for neighbors, saved every euro, and by the time the first editor wrote about the mysterious young tailor from the 12th, I'd already stitched my name into the city. When I married Gabriel Moreau, I thought I'd learned everything there was to know about threads. He taught me otherwise. He didn't work with fabric, he worked with words, but his sentences had seams too. He believed if you followed a line of language long enough, you'd find where the truth had been hemmed shut. We met at a community protest. He was there with a recorder and notebook. I was there with a placard that read, "Dyes don't die in rivers." Later, he told me he'd noticed my hands before my face, the way I gripped the sign like something that could unravel the world. I told him he exaggerated. He smiled and said exaggeration was just honesty seen through a magnifying glass. That was 5 years ago. Before the sirens, before the lawyers, before the word traitor crawled across his photograph on every newsfeed. Now the sign above my studio door still says, Monroe Atelier. The name Moreau is nowhere. Not on my invoices, not on my business registration, not even on my mailbox. The landlord once asked why. I told him the truth, that sometimes names rot faster than fruit when left in the sun. Gabriel called himself a journalist, but the word never felt big enough for what he did. He chased what others ignored, the invisible poisons, the invisible people. He wrote about children in factory towns who coughed up dust, about rivers that glowed faintly blue at night, about the companies that made fortunes selling purity while burying their waste. The last one he investigated was Vintera Tech, Helga Winter's empire. Officially, they produced biodegradable polymers for a cleaner tomorrow. Unofficially, they produced sickness. The factory outside Lyon leaked something into the groundwater, something no one could pronounce without a mask. I still remember the evening he came home with that look, the one halfway between discovery and dread. He dropped a stack of files on the table and said, "Lise, if this is true, they've been lying for years." His hands were trembling, not from fear but from purpose. I asked him if it was dangerous. He laughed softly. "Only if it's real." It was real. Too real. Within a month, he'd published the first part of his investigation. Photographs, interviews, water testing data. The article went viral, shared, debated, buried, revived. Vintera Tech denied everything. Their lawyers released a statement calling his research fabricated and defamatory. Then came the second article, the one that included leaked internal memos, emails from senior staff discussing containment, liability, and narrative management. It was clean journalism, cross-checked, sourced, but it hit like an explosion. 2 days later, he didn't come home. I still hear the knock. Not the polite rat-tat of neighbors, but the official one. Flat, rehearsed, the rhythm of a warrant. I'd been fitting a client when the door banged. 3 men in gray suits, 2 uniforms behind them. They said they were cybercrime investigators. They asked for Gabriel. I told them he wasn't home. They said they knew. They searched everything. Our computers, his notebooks, even the lining of our couch cushions. They called it procedure. When I asked what he'd done, the tallest one said, "Your husband stole proprietary data from a national corporation." His tone was clinical, like reading a recipe. "They took my laptop, too." I laughed, a strange, sharp sound that made one of them look away. What use would they have for sewing patterns and invoices? But then I realized that in a world like theirs, everything was data, even dreams. That night, the news broke. Investigative journalist Gabriel Moreau arrested for data theft and sabotage. His face filled the screen above a line of text that made him sound like a villain in his own story. They said he'd hacked into Vintera Tech's servers, that he'd manipulated environmental reports to smear the company, that he'd been paid by foreign interests. I sat on the floor of our apartment and watched the anchors dissect him with surgical detachment. Every sentence was a suture closing around his life. When I called the police, they said he was under investigation. When I called the ministry, they said it was a matter of national security. When I called Helga Winter's office, the receptionist put me on hold for 43 minutes before saying, "Mrs. Moreau, the company does not comment on active legal matters." I stopped calling after that. For weeks, I lived between court corridors and the studio, waiting for news. The journalists who had once quoted his work now avoided my messages. Sponsors withdrew from my upcoming showcase. They said it was reputational risk. Clients canceled fittings. Even the fabric suppliers grew polite and distant. "Nothing personal, Madame Monroe," they said. "We simply have to protect ourselves." It's remarkable how quickly people forget that loyalty is also a kind of fabric. It unravels once you stop touching it. When the preliminary hearing finally came, they wouldn't let me see him. I caught a glimpse through the glass, a profile I knew better than my own reflection, thinner, bruised by sleeplessness but still upright. He didn't see me. The guard pushed him forward, wrists cuffed, head high. The judge denied bail. "Flight risk," he said, as if anyone who loved truth had anywhere left to run. I remember walking out of that courtroom into the blinding spring sunlight. The protesters outside were shouting slogans about freedom of the press, but the cameras weren't pointed at them. They were pointed at Helga Winter. She arrived in a white suit, immaculate, stepping out of a self-driving car as if the world were a runway. The microphones caught her statement perfectly. Vinteratech supports freedom of expression, but we cannot allow criminal behavior to endanger innovation or the environment we are trying to protect. Her smile was soft, almost maternal. The crowd applauded. I stood behind the barrier, invisible among the bodies, and for a second she turned her head. Our eyes met through the chaos. She didn't recognize me. Why would she? I was just another tailor who'd once mended her husband's shirts. That was the first time I thought, you'll wear your truth someday. After Gabriel's arrest, I closed the apartment and moved back into the studio. At first it was practical. The rent was cheaper and the machines kept me company. But soon the rhythm of work became something else, a kind of survival code. Each morning I opened the shutters, brewed bitter coffee, and pretended the world outside still cared about fabric. It was during those months that I stopped signing Moreau. The newspapers had made the name radioactive. Clients whispered, neighbors stared, and someone scrawled, "Trader's wife," across my door in chalk. I washed it off 3 times before giving up and repainting the door entirely. When the new sign went up, Monroe Atelier, by appointment only, the city exhaled, the chalk stopped appearing. I told myself it was just branding. But deep down, I knew it was camouflage. Names are strange things. They can protect or condemn, open doors or close them. Mine had done both. Monroe became my shield, my silence. Moreau stayed folded inside me like a secret seam, visible only if you knew where to look. Sometimes clients asked if I was related to that journalist. I'd smile and say, no relation. Lies like fabric need tension to hold. I gave them just enough to keep from tearing. At night, I reread his articles, the ones still archived online before they were scrubbed. Each paragraph felt like a voice from underwater, muted, desperate, still fighting to surface. He had written, "Transparency is not an act of rebellion, it's a form of hygiene." They used that line against him in court, twisting it into proof of his ideological extremism. That was Helga Winter's genius. She could turn purity into propaganda faster than I could thread a needle. I watched her interviews on late-night talk shows, smiling under soft lights, speaking about empowering women in science and closing the loop of waste. She always wore white, the color of innocence marketed to death. When she mentioned her husband, the former Minister of Commerce, she called him a visionary. When she mentioned the environment, she called it our shared responsibility. She never mentioned Gabriel. She didn't need to. The silence around his name was part of her narrative now, part of the controlled vocabulary of progress. The weeks blurred. Letters from the prison came sporadically, censored and delayed. His handwriting grew smaller, cramped between blacked-out lines. Oh, he never complained. He asked about my work, about the studio, about the city. "Keep creating," he wrote once. "That's your rebellion." I pinned that sentence above my desk. Every morning I read it before turning on the machines. Then last month came the envelope with the government seal. Case adjourned, court date pending. No release, no explanation, no end. The same week, an email arrived through the studio website. It was brief, unsigned, urgent client, corporate event, high profile, immediate response required. I almost ignored it. Most urgent clients were influencers with delusions of royalty. But something about the phrasing, corporate event, high profile, made my stomach twist. I clicked the attachment. Logo, Vinteratech. Name, Helga Winter. Subject, Custom Couture Commission for upcoming Global Future Summit. I read it twice, certain it was a mistake. Then I laughed out loud, a brittle sound that echoed off the bare walls. Fate doesn't knock politely. Sometimes it sends an email with perfect grammar. The next morning, she arrived in person, just as chapter 1 of this story began. And as I measured her, I realized the strangest thing. I felt calm. No shaking, no rage, just precision. You'd think hatred would make the hands unsteady. Mine never were steadier. I didn't plan anything then. Not yet. All I knew was that the universe had finally returned the thread it had taken. What I chose to do with it would define the rest of my life. When she left, I sat by the window watching her car glide away. Her reflection lingered in the glass. White coat, immaculate posture, the halo of a woman convinced the world existed to flatter her. The city lights flickered on behind her, reflected in the glass like distant fires. I traced one of them with my finger and whispered his name. Gabriel. The word barely reached the air, but I felt it vibrate in the room, traveling through every spool, every needle, every piece of fabric I'd ever touched. Somewhere inside the walls, the machines hummed an answer. Or maybe it was just my heartbeat. That night, I reopened a box I hadn't touched in months. Inside were remnants of old projects, scraps of fabric, rejected samples, materials I'd once hoped to reuse. On top lay a folded envelope marked VT23A. I'd found it months earlier in a pile of discarded textile shipments from Vinteratech's testing division. Experimental composites meant to biodegrade under environmental stress. I lifted one strip from the envelope. The texture was strange, smooth, almost oily. Under the light, it shimmered faintly, like a pearl hiding a bruise. I'd run tests back then, out of curiosity. The material had reacted to heat, to moisture, to the salt of skin. I'd set it aside, telling myself I wanted to understand it. Now I understood enough. I placed the sample on the cutting table beside the sketch I'd drawn for Helga Winter that morning. The lines of the gown curved elegantly, power disguised as grace. For a moment, I just stood there, watching the fabric catch the lamplight. Then I turned off the radio, closed the blinds, and whispered into the quiet. You'll get the dress you deserve. The machine stirred to life, a low mechanical sigh that sounded almost human. Outside, the night thickened with rain. Inside, I began to sew. They dressed the hall in virtue. Glass chandeliers like captured constellations. Living trees craned from rented soil to flank a stage whose LED wall pulsed with soft gradients. Sea foam to glacier blue, the color story of a planet well-behaved. Volunteers in white suits whispered into headsets. Waiters floated on rubber soles, balancing flutes of something that pretended to be champagne but tasted, like most of tonight, of PR and sugar. My lanyard said, production consultant. The name read, Elise Monroe. It always does. Backstage, the air smelled of hairspray and money. Assistants checked run-of-show slides while the show director ticked cues with a pencil that had never met wood. He didn't notice me move along the cables, past the racks of backup microphones and emergency podiums, toward the dim corner where the AV servers hummed like patient animals. I touched the metal only once, the way you touch a sleeping dog you still trust to love you. 3 minutes, someone called. Panels to places? Keynotes stand by. I exhaled and slipped through the curtain into the wings. From here, the stage was an aquarium, glass walls holding powerful fish. The audience shimmered. Ministers, influencers, founders, men who spoke on behalf of sunlight. Cameras hovered like obedient comets. Every lens waited for the woman in white. And then she arrived. Helga Winter moved the way rich weather moves, deciding what everyone else would experience. The dress, a cathedral of clean lines and silver hush, caught light the way promises do. She wore the thing like it had never belonged to anyone else, as if I hadn't coaxed it into being stitch by deliberate stitch. Up close, I could see where the fabric rested against her skin, how it learned her in seconds. Mrs. Winter, you look... The show director lost the word and settled for reverent silence. She smiled, not to him but to the future she had paid to meet. Our eyes found each other because fate is short-sighted and loves drama. She nodded once, the way one professional acknowledges another. Ready? She asked me, soft enough for only us. As ever, I said. She took her place behind the stage wall while the host did the dance of gratitude. Sponsors, partners, donors, the usual genuflections. In the prompter's glow, I saw my name where it never appears. Embedded in a Cat7 cable, in a file checksum, in a stitch. I rubbed my thumb against my index finger and felt the faintest ghost of polymer dust. Introducing, the host said, the woman who is redefining sustainable materials, Helga Winter. Applause rose like a well-trained bird. The music swelled, then cut. Helga stepped into the aquarium. Under the lights, the dress turned almost liquid. A river behaving itself. It breathed with her. The fabric was made to flex, to mirror the body, to flatter the myth of control. It skimmed her collarbones like grammar, slid along her hip with a subordinating clause, obeyed. Good evening, she said, and the microphones loved her. Thank you for coming to imagine a cleaner tomorrow with us. She talked about childhood beaches that had somehow always had the right shells. She talked about closing loops and circularity and accountability at scale. She thanked the partners, the labs, the workers whose names looked powerful on slides but forgettable on time cards. She made it sound effortless. To turn waste into wonder, to turn a river's green foam into a product roadmap, to turn my husband's name into a silence. I watched her hands. They were steady. Every gesture had been rehearsed, every pivot, trialed and approved. The dress moved when she did, obedient, seamless as denial. What the cameras could not see, what no one ever thinks to film, was the way sweat begins. How it beads first at the most honest places, not under arms, but at the sternum, at the small of the back, at the hollow where a breath chooses between staying and leaving. The fabric had been engineered for moisture wicking. The lab notes claimed comfort under stress. I had read the memos that said otherwise. Helga finished the first cadence and smiled as the audience clapped on cue. She took a sip of water from a glass that had never met tap, and the prompter fed her the next paragraph. Tonight, she said, we unveil a breakthrough textile. The screen behind her bloomed with a title card. VT23A, Purity You Can Wear. The crowd leaned forward. Investors recognized the vowel sounds of valuation. A biodegradable composite that maintains structural integrity while... She stopped. It was small, a dropped syllable. People drop them all the time. But a woman like her does not. A woman like her is built from syllables that never fall. Her tongue pressed to the inside of her cheek. A tiny, annoyed press, as if a seed had lodged in a tooth. She continued, but something inside the consonants had shifted. A grain of sand under the polished shoe of her voice. Under the lights, VT23A did what it had always done in the lab when the junior chemists stared too long and the lead scientist said, "We'll fix that in the next iteration." It began to remember what it was made from. It started at the neckline. A blush, the kind that stylists pay to mimic and dermatologists dread. A raw undertone beneath the elegant calm. A single camera bored with the wide, punched in for a portrait shot and caught the skin thinking. Helga's eyes flashed annoyance, physiology, the body's quiet treason. She swallowed. The prompter scrolled like a river trying to be helpful. While reducing microplastics shed by traditional synthetics by as much as... The flush deepened at the décolletage, then ghosted along her clavicle in a map I could have traced with my eyes closed. I had built the cartography. VT23A was an algorithm of salvaged industrial polymer chains bound in a plant-based matrix with a proprietary surfactant system. The patent language praised its dermal neutrality across intended use conditions. The internal report, buried 2 subfolders deep under investor deck drafts, had warned elevated perspiration. Plus heat, plus salt may catalyze irritant release in early batches. Avoid prolonged skin contact in high-stress settings. High-stress settings like a live-streamed keynote. Helga slowed. The dress, obedient animal that it was, adjusted its drape. I could see where it kissed the sternum, where the salt of the skin asked the polymer a question it had been trained not to answer. She kept speaking. She is good at speaking through variables. But her hand flicked once to the hollow above her heart and then retreated, a small betrayal. The feed director, alert at his nest of screens, switched angles, cut to an audience reaction, then back. In the front row, two men with the same haircut frowned in unison. I stood very still in the wings and listened to my pulse. A textile that does not compromise comfort, Helga said, each word now a rung on a ladder. A textile that loves the future as much as we do. On future, she stuttered. It happened fast after that. The blush turned to stipple, a necklace of pinprick red. The fluorescent normalization of the stage lights made it look festive for 3 seconds. In the fourth, medical. She felt it. Everyone could feel her feeling it. The audience's curiosity leaned forward, then stepped back. That instinct humans have when another human's body tells a truth. Helga paused and smiled in the ancient way of queens. I am fine. You are fine. The conditions are perfect. Excuse me, she said lightly. New material jitters. The audience laughed. She calibrated to the humor. A dress that's excited to be here. Where were we? We were at Q47. Backstage, the show director whispered, Roll deck, impact partners. The AV tech nodded and reached for the keyboard. My hand was already there. A small code written in a language attention never notices ran exactly where it was supposed to. It was not a hack. I hate that word. Hacks are messy, juvenile, proud of their own fingerprints. This was a stitch you don't see until you tug it, and the whole thing remembers it was only tense fabric. The LED wall didn't jump, or glitch, or do anything dramatic. It simply obeyed a new order with the serene confidence of a schedule pre-approved. The impact partners slide breathed once, then yielded to a white field. Black text gathered itself in the center. VT23A, internals, field stability memo. Confidential, 14 months prior. No one clapped now. The words were not loud. I don't like loud. They were legible. The kind of legible that wins lawsuits. Observed dermal responses in test group under stress conditions. Erythema, burning sensation, urticaria-like rash. Lab recommended mitigation, discontinue batch, notify procurement. Management note, proceed, adjust launch narrative, secure liability insurance rider. The room made a sound I'd never heard an institution make. A collective intake of breath that didn't know which body it belonged to. Helga turned, still mic'd. Her face, the market's favorite billboard, remained composed. Composure is a muscle you train by injuring it often. She faced the screen, then us. What is this? She asked. The mic delivered it pristine to the audience and to the internet. The next slide did not wait for permission. VT23A, field footage, Waterway S13 video, handheld, shaky, unpretty. A stream I knew without captions. Its banks the same dirty reads from my husband's photographs, the water, a tea the color of surrender. The footage cut to a child's arm, scratching at a hive-red rash while a woman, off-camera, whispered a prayer that sounded like it had been said too often to work. The audience, elevated, insulated, ethically moisturized, sat inside the aquarium and watched the river come in. The silence was the sound of a thesis eating its conclusion. Cut feed, someone said in my headset, which I was not wearing. Cut feed now. The server rack obeyed me, not them. Louis, thin, quiet Louis, who had once delivered thread and news to a different version of me, stood by the O console with his hands folded like a choir boy. I didn't look at me. He didn't need to. The show was in the stitch. The next card, sourcing, batch VT23A, lot 11, sample A7, destination, Global Future Summit, keynote, dress tailor, Monroe, atelier material verification, third-party test lab report, full, chain of custody receipts, download, spectrograph match, overlay. This was the part that looked like theater and was the opposite. The QR code in the lower corner was ugly on purpose. Elegance lies. Evidence travels in plain clothes. In the hall, phones rose the way flowers do when the sun is finally the right temperature. Helga did not move. Her jaw took on that density marble gets when it has learned human shapes. She said nothing, which is a form of speaking so advanced it runs on the body's battery. On the screen, the lab report pivoted through its pages, the cursor resting with clinical patience on phrases like non-disclosed additive and unreported sensitizer. The spectrograph overlay slid like a confession over the hem of a dress. Not any dress, the dress. Its peaks and troughs identical to the sample declared unsuitable in the internal memo. Above it all, a side-by-side, the marketing clip of VT23A rippling in a wind tunnel, like Virtue, and the underdesk phone video of a technician blotting her forearm with milk after a patch test bloomed. Investors learn to calculate while looking compassionate. You could watch them do both. Helga lifted the mic from her collar. Her hand shook. She caught the tremor and smoothed it like a wrinkle. "This is misinformation," she said, choosing the most expensive word in the room. A manipulated... The feed cut her politely and replaced her with an email. From hvinnerovinneratech.com to CSCI Ops Legal Comms. Subject: VT23A Public Narrative advised to contain. We proceed per launch plan. Note: ensure legal firewall around early batches. Philanthropic storytelling must outpace activist noise. Secure friendly press. Flag the journalist Moreau for ongoing monitoring. I didn't breathe. I had seen this email, printed it, held it in the stupid warmth of my hands. Seeing it like this, white on white, felt like being the knife that finally meets the truth's bone. Helga stared at it and then past it, right to the place where I stood. Our eyes found each other, and for once, hers did not hold. There is a point where power understands it has moved past strategy into physics. Gravity always wins. The rash had climbed now, not dramatic. Nothing TV could fetishize. No swelling, no hospital. Just the body reporting the truth at the exact moment the brand could not contain another story. She brought her hand up. Slow, pressed it to her chest the way people do when their heart remembers how honest it is. Silver mic, white fabric, red stipple. A narrative printed in Braille. She said, and lost the pronoun. The screen offered no comfort. It showed receipts. It showed the chain between a river and a keynote. It showed a suit jacket, my husband's, hanging limp at the end of a video call with poor connection because the state doesn't upgrade prison Wi-Fi. It showed the timestamp of a court filing where the charge sheet spelled his name wrong, but got the years right. Then the final slide, the only one I wrote in my own voice. What you wear is what you do. VT23A is not future. It is exteriorized liability. Tonight's dress is made from Vinteratech's own clean composite, batch 11, sample A7. If it irritates the skin, imagine the river. Beneath it, a link, full dossier, and a second link, motion to reopen State versus Moreau, filed. The file had gone live 30 seconds earlier, triggered by the same cue that rolled the slide. The internet, that gentle scavenger, was already eating. A murmur started in the back row. The kind that begins as etiquette and ends as history. Phones hummed. A minister's aide spoke rapidly into a sleeve. Somewhere, 3 legal teams woke up without sleeping. Helga took a step forward. End the feed, she said, and was surprised to hear herself beg. Control is a drug that makes its withdrawal public. The show director gestured furious semaphore. The AV tech looked at me and then at the checklist that said, Auto Advance Locked. In the wings, Louis finally met my eyes. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The dress had done the only thing a dress can, told the truth of touch. Helga tried to keep speaking. That is her job. She said the words safety, partnership, innovation. They fell on the floor with a sound like scissors. Security approached, awkward because guardians of image are rarely trained for the body's revolt. One offered a blazer. She waved it away. It would have helped. Some metaphors are useful. I stepped into the sightline at last, not onto the stage, but close enough for her to choose to look at me. She did. In her gaze, I saw 1,000 people who would never meet her. Women in factory rooms, boys carrying drums of slosh, a girl by a river scratching a map into her own arm. For a second, I thought she might cry, and I wished she would, not for me, but for the human she has insisted for so long on ignoring. She did not. She straightened like a conclusion, nodded as if someone had thanked her, and walked off to the right, the dress whispering around her ankles like a tide pulling back after it has learned the names of stones. The audience sat. The lights held. The screen did not play the sizzle reel. Instead, it offered a list of independent labs and the docket number for the court motion and a helpline for communities near plants whose water grew foam in summer. The show director said house to half, and the house pretended to understand fractions. I left by the back corridor where catering trays stacked themselves like industrious beetles. It smelled like rosemary and expensive spinach. The hallway opened onto a loading dock that looked the way all docks look when truth has just walked through a building. A place that understands weight. Rain had started. The honest kind that falls on everyone. The city's light leaked onto the wet asphalt, turning the puddles into failed constellations. I stood with my hands in the pockets of my black coat and let the air rinse my face. My phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. The language of the state is always formal. Ray Moreau, Gabriel motion received. Court grants expedited review. Counsel notified. Expedited. A word that often means not you. Tonight, it meant now. Another message from a number that used to send me grocery lists and photographs of graffiti that looked like poems. Lisa, is it you? The guard said, they're moving me to the city. Hearing tomorrow. I laughed then without sound, the way bodies laugh when lungs vote yes and the world mistakes it for breath. I typed, I'm here, and erased it. I typed, I made a dress, and erased that too. I typed nothing because there are moments when words are a worse lie than silence. Behind me, the hall exhaled, and then inhaled panic. The press found its angles. People with very clean shoes explained very dirty things to people whose shoes would never be clean again. I walked. Around the corner, a river ran where it always runs. The way blood runs where it must. The rain tried to become it and succeeded. I thought of the lab notes, of the internal memo, of the word contain. I thought of my husband tracing the seams of a sentence until it confessed its tailor. I thought of the dress and the skin and the fact that the body is the last journalist. It reports, and you either listen or you don't. On the bridge, I stopped and looked down at the surface. City light made it look like something a painter might call mercy. I pressed my palms to the rail, absently rubbing the pad of my thumb with the nail of my index finger, the way you do when you've held a needle too long and your skin has learned the lesson. Footsteps. Louis, quiet as a fact, came to stand beside me. You all right? He asked. Yes, I said, and understood that I was. We watched the water take the rain. After a while, he said, they'll say you hurt her. I didn't, I said. Her company did. He nodded, which is a form of saying we know. Then he handed me a folded flyer someone had pushed into his hands at the door. On it, a QR and a line. What you wear is what you do. I laughed. We had made propaganda for truth. What now? He asked. Now, I said, I go home. I sleep. In the morning, I put on something I made. Then I go to court and say my name. He looked at me, surprised. Your which name? Both, I said. The one on the door and the one they tried to erase. We stood until the rain learned patience and the city forgave itself for nothing. When I turned to leave, Louis touched my sleeve. You sewed it well, he said. I always do, I answered, and meant it for everything I had ever made that did not try to be more than itself. Back at the studio, I unlocked the door and let the dark in with me. I did not turn on the overheads. The desk lamp was enough. Small, faithful. On the cutting table lay my notebook, open to the last order. I picked up a pencil and wrote beneath it, in a hand that belonged equally to Monroe and Moreau, account reopened. Then I crossed out reopened and wrote set right. I washed my hands. The water ran clean. I watched it anyway, as if it could sing. I hung my coat. I set my phone face down. I lay on the couch that used to be a bed and closed my eyes. In the morning, I would stand in a building that loved marble more than people and tell a truth they had taught me to sow. I would say Elise Monroe, 33, Taylor, and then I would say Elise Moreau, wife, and the room would understand that sometimes the same body carries both. On the far wall, a dress form waited naked and happy. I imagined the next garment, blue perhaps, the color of a sky that has learned again how to be looked at. No lining full of secrets, no thread carrying a second job, just something that holds a person and doesn't ask them to lie. I slept. Somewhere, a server farm cooled itself and refused to forget. Somewhere, a river moved its shoulder and kept going. Somewhere, a woman in a white dress stared at her skin and learned the first sentence in a language she had made a fortune not speaking. People will say later that I ruined her. People will say I saved something. People will decide which noun feels best in their mouths, and they will be right for themselves. I will keep the only verb that ever made sense to me, I sow.